Welcome to The Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to The Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Well, a little over a year ago, I opened my show with Jay Richards with this statement. It's now October 2020, and it looks like the worst of the virus is long behind us. And yet we are still in the midst of a pandemic of fear that is far worse than the virus. And it's a crisis that has basically divided the country into two camps: open America up or keep it shut down. Well, that was then, and this is now, and now seems worse. And it seems to have morphed from government measures to stop the spread of an unstoppable virus into some existential threat, and that's an overused word, but I do think it is, an existential threat to our liberties and civil rights, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. Joining me to talk about this is James Patrick, documentary filmmaker, whose film Planet Lockdown is coming out January 15th in 2022, and Jay Richards, frequent guest, author of Price of Panic, who is now the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and is the author of more than a dozen books. James, Jay, great to see you.
Good to see
Jay,
you, Bill.
why don't you kick us off? Give us a little
Yeah.
context for where we are right now as you see it.
Absolutely. So as you said, a year ago when we wrote The Price of Panic, it was focused mainly on the unintended consequences of the lockdown. People assumed that lockdowns were some tried and true measure to prevent the spread of a respiratory virus. In fact, they were a hypothesis waiting to be tested, and the human race ended up being the subjects of the experiment. I think we showed, and a lot of people have showed since then, that in fact the lockdowns don't correlate to a reduction in the spread of the virus. They just don't work. That's the moderately bad news. The really bad news is that they do a great deal of harm. So they're all pain and no gain. But that's what we were really talking about, fall of 2020. We were talking about the problems with the lockdowns. Now, of course, we're talking about a heck of a lot more. We've got the vaccines, we've got vaccine mandates, and now we're hearing tell of vaccine passports in which people can't exercise their basic rights unless they've been properly vaccinated, and that, of course, is a moving target. And as you said, I think this is an existential threat to our liberties and to our freedom. And here's the problem, as I see it. There's never a good time to put your foot in for an incremental tyranny. We always expect tyranny to come in sort of one fell swoop. The troops march across the Maginot Line or something like that. Now it's time. But this is an incremental tyranny in which each little detail doesn't seem like that big a deal. Well, just wear this silly mask. Well, don't go to the grocery store. Just get a shot. There's never any obvious time. And so I think it takes a bit of discernment to understand what's happening in the big picture. And I think at this point, my hope is that it's gotten so far along that more and more people will be aware of that.
Well, I think if we do our job and keep getting the word out, maybe we can nip this, I won't say in the bud, it's long past the bud. It's pretty long and branch.
Yeah.
James, your film is extraordinary, very, very well researched, and you've traveled the world to get the leading experts to bring their stories forth and their points of view forth. Talk about that. What gave you the idea? How did it bring about? How long did it take to make? And
yeah, it took about a year and a half now, and I was just very upset when I heard lockdown, and it seemed to me more of an economic takedown measure to help big business and destroy small business. But within a few weeks of the lockdown, I was seeing advertisements for immunity passports. It looked like tens of millions of dollars were being pumped into these companies. The talk of these vaccines, and I could tell this was headed in a very dark direction. So after a few months sitting at home like everyone else, I was just restless and so upset about what was going on. I said I have to do something about it, and so I decided to make a film about it, and put 40 grand on zero interest credit cards to buy the equipment and set out to do it, and And by Christmas, the situation was developing so quickly, I decided to just release all the full interviews in full. And I think Christmas, I started putting them out a year ago, and they've been getting, millions of views, and I put up 40 interviews.
But we talk about civil liberties
Yeah.
and our rights and speech. A lot of these got pulled.
Yeah, a lot of them. Yeah, like half of them at least.
So YouTube,
Yeah, YouTube censors that. I mean, Planet Lockdown's like a banned phrase on most of the platforms. So
maybe we won't use that in the title for the show. We'll sneak it in somewhere.
yeah, you may not want to.
So do you want to show us
Yeah.
the opening?
Yeah, sure.
the
Why don't
opening
we-
of this?
why don't we
This
take a look at the
this is
soft
really,
opening?
it give you a sense of how, I can't believe this is $40,000 worth of movie making, because it looks like a lot more. So kudos.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at this. And
We are in a strange place, in a strange place, in the corona lockdown, that would be the opening. That would be the opening.
I have never seen the Great Lawn so empty. This is not life. The government is destroying people's lives, just creating fear, making people behave rationally.
I was very puzzled since the very beginning, and I was alert to the fact that what we were living was not quite right.
It was like a programmed and orchestrated action, which was almost in the same way all over the world.
true,
Yeah.
truer words. So,
Yeah.
so how much time did you spend traveling around to do this?
Maybe 6 months.
And
On
where'd you
the- on
find
the
all,
road.
you've got some of the leading experts. I mean,
Yeah.
who are the three people we just talked about here?
That's Knut Wachowski in New York. He's a top world-class epidemiologist who worked at Rockefeller University for 20 years but retired, I think, or did his own stuff 3 years prior. So he's like free to talk. And then Alexandra, she's a very high-level geneticist, and in Paris, she's, I think, was the former research director of the French NIH. And then this is Bishop Schneider, who's outspoken on the topic.
And where's he based?
He's like the adjunct
Auxiliary Bishop of Kazakhstan,
of
I believe.
Kazakhstan, yeah. But travels a lot. The guy travels all the time.
And then you had this extraordinary expert, Jay Richards, on later
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, so it's quite the odyssey going around and meeting these people and hearing their perspectives, and it's quite an experience.
How did the making of the movie change you and your views? And how will it change the people who watch it?
I think it's almost like when we've been watching the world fall apart. So it's like you kind of go through these stages of grieving, like like Kubler-Ross is like there's denial, then there's bargaining, and so I think I, like everybody else, has gone through that, and so I've come out the other side now, and and I think it's important to understand that this whole thing is really trying to take everything from everybody. They're kind of going for everything. It's like so I really would encourage people not to give in to this measure than the next one, because it's going in a direction where you don't want to go, in a world you don't want to live in. So people think, oh, I'm just going to go along, I'm just going to do this thing they're asking, but it's just incrementally more and more and more, and then you're not going to get your freedom back by continue to go along with this this whole narrative. It's just getting weirder and weirder. So.
Jay, how dangerous has this virus actually been?
Well, it depends on who we're talking about. So it's very, very low risk for young people. There's about 1,000-fold difference between its risk for young people versus old people. So if you're over 70 and you have so-called comorbidities, which means things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, then it can be bad. It's still about a 95% survival rate even then, but that's severe compared to very, very, very mild effects for the young. And we knew this within weeks. We knew this in March and early April of 2020, that the right way to deal with this is not to lock everyone down, but to focus on the people that are at the greatest risk from sickness and death as a result of infection. But we didn't do that. We basically ignored all the actual data we had about this. And so I think, the problem is you can't say, well, it's just like a mild cold. Well, it's like a mild cold for most people. And that it's more dangerous than the flu for older people. But that's just what we learned about the virus. So I forgive people in March that didn't know, but by April, informed people should have been able to figure this out.
Yeah, I mean, by early May last year, some studies came out from Stanford and other places showing that it was like a flu-level infection fatality rate. But there's just a total disconnect between that and the level of fear, and then all these statistics thrown at us. So it's quite messy and hard for the average person to make sense of it all.
But when you and I talked over a year ago about this, there was a lot. The jury wasn't in on a lot, but now we've got Sweden, we've got Florida, we've got actual data about what different techniques used to mitigate this virus worked or didn't work.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and our book is filled with statistics about the effects or lack thereof of those lockdowns. That was the sort of nice thing that happened. Nice thing about federalism is that we had 50 states. Most had some form of lockdown, but they started at different times. They opened at different times, and we could actually look at the spread of the cases and hospitalizations and things like that. And there's just no correlation between the lockdowns and what the virus did, which is not at all surprising. But what's interesting is that James, early on, was noticing the vaccines, whereas I could say we all dip into this differently. But the way I entered into this was that I was aghast to realize that international public health officials were following an untested predictive computer model to figure out how dangerous a virus was that hadn't been tested. It was entirely speculative. We learned very quickly that this Imperial College London model that the head of the World Health Organization was following was just completely useless for telling us the actual risks of the virus. It was just, all the assumptions get plugged in, and guess what? The model tells you what you told it to tell you. So that's what interested me and my co-authors, is that this is going to be a really, really bad policy because it's not based on reality. We weren't really focused on the vaccines. I wasn't focused on the drug companies or anything like that. But I do think there's a sort of deeper story about what was happening beforehand and why so quickly we pivoted to talk about the vaccines that I think in the film does a great job of laying out.
Yeah, and I think it raises fundamental questions of we can get into the conversation of how deadly is it, or do the vaccines work, or these kinds of things. But I think we should step back and look at it like, do they have the right to lock us down, to take these measures, even if we had a 50% mortality rate disease. I don't think the government has the right to take the actions it does, or even if the vaccines do work, can they force that on people? Do we own our own bodies? And that's a fundamental principle of civilization, of a society. Do you own your own body? Are you a slave? Or, it's. I would encourage people not to get bogged down in this minutia, but really see this as a civil rights issue. And we don't, right? The governments around the world have in tandem, ratcheted up their control of people, and in a way that's really disturbing.
It's a civil rights issue. This is the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Jay Richards and James Patrick, filmmaker. Jay's at Heritage Foundation, and we're talking about how this whole virus issue is morphed into a civil rights issue, but it's also morphed into a speech issue. And, as we were joking, or maybe not joking before we started talking about this on air, is that there are just an awful lot of things you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to talk about ivermectin.
No.
You're not really allowed to talk about whether the vaccines work or don't work. You're not allowed to talk about the pharmaceutical companies and whether they've got an agenda. There's all this forbidden speech that's being monitored by the social media companies, among others, but also the regular mainstream media.
Yeah, and it's just totally arbitrary sometimes. I did one interview with Allerberger, who's the chief epidemiologist of Austria, and interviewed him in Austria, and they called it medical misinformation and took it down. And I mean, he's the chief medical authority of the country that I was doing the interview in.
Well, my favorite was that you got a hit piece written about your film by the Washington Post, the almighty Washington Post. But you look through, and in the article there was an assertion, well, James says this and that's wrong. James says that and that's wrong too, and it goes on and on. So I looked up who the author was, and it's just like this nice little girl who's got a degree in journalism from or English from UCLA and journalism from Columbia, and her beat was the Metropolitan beat. She doesn't know anything about this science, and yet she's pronouncing, and it comes with the authority of the Post.
That's right. Yeah, and the Post comes with the authority of public health agencies. The irony is that the media, rather than the corporate media, rather than speaking truth to power, is actually speaking authorized truth for power. I mean, that's the sort of irony.
Yeah, and that article makes a lot of claims that she clearly didn't watch the videos she's criticizing. She was just ordered to do that. And then she's referencing these Hopkins sites, and you go to that, they're making unsubstantiated claims that are invalid. And it's like the way this is working is like the media is not responsible, the public health agencies, they're all doing their role, and no one's really can be held accountable for anything. Like Johns Hopkins has done a lot of damage in this, and the link in that article, if you go read that site, they're making unsubstantiated claims that you would need several year-long trial to prove, and yet the Post is able to just refer to that, but it's fraudulent. It's troubling, and then. It's confusing for the average person just dipping their toe in it, trying to understand what's going on, and they see these fancy names there, but they're being misled, and.
I mean, Bill, I think this has been the kind of key intellectual question from the beginning for lots of people. And I talk to people all the time that say, look, Jay, I mean, everything you're telling me makes sense, but are you saying that I should just not believe all these authorities that I'm hearing? Public health authorities or media. Now, people aren't actually checking the CDC website. If you press them, usually what they know about what the CDC says is what the headlines on the right-hand corner of their screen on Twitter is. And so what they're actually getting is a kind of consolidation of certain claims by social media, or it's almost ideal. It's better if they're at least reading the pages of the Washington Post. What they're actually doing is they're reading headlines that have been highly curated. And so it's not like they're actually accessing the official statements. But this has been the question from the very beginning. If public health authorities were speaking outside their authority, if the media were serving the role of these actors and had no idea what they were talking about, if there was a social contagion that was justified under terms of public health, how would you tell? Right? That's the question we ought to be asking. Well, I wouldn't want to go along if it was just this crazy social contagion by saying, well, this is what the public health authorities said. And so that's really, I think, it's sort of the prior philosophical question. How would you tell if you're in the middle of a crazy social contagion in which you thought all the official voices, what they were saying actually wasn't true? And that's the sort of prior question we all need to ask ourselves. And those who, for whatever reason, were less inclined simply to believe these people based on their authority, I think we're more likely to wake up early than not.
Well, I think the public trust issue is enormous. I mean, if anything is done, I can't think of anything that's done more to destroy public trust than the way they've handled this.
Yeah.
You look at the CDC and this issue of herd immunity.
Yeah.
The standard thing about viruses, we all know this, is it gets into the population, enough people get it, and all of a sudden everybody's immune because that's the way it works. Well, the CDC changed the definition of herd immunity. The new definition focuses on vaccines only, and they took away the part about building herd immunity through previous infections.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Yeah, the WHO as well, they did it a month before they released the vaccines, last November or so.
I mean, so how many little details like that should a person need before they say, maybe I need to rethink my prior trust of these authorities. These
Yeah.
are, I mean, this is
Unfortunately,
a
I've got
well-known
6
thing.
pages of details.
Yeah, exactly. So how many do people need before you say maybe you want to rethink that implicit trust?
But the conversation that we're having right now is not, if you go on the 6 o'clock news,
Oh, no.
you're not hearing this conversation.
Yeah.
And how like intertwined industry is with these agencies and how huge portions of their budget. I mean, with WHO, it's like over half, and CDC, even there's a CDC foundation. They
Over
get
half of the WHO budgets from
These
pharmaceutical
these-
industry or healthcare
these
industry.
public-private partnerships where
And the
these-
People's Republic of China, Bill
these sort of-
Gates. Yeah.
Yeah,
people's- yeah.
these foundations give money for like project dedicated tasks. And so it's over half the budget, and it creates a huge conflict of interest. So they have inordinate sway over what the organization does. So that's why you see all these games with redefining things.
Well, that's one of the principal way, for China's many ways. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things they do is they give a lot of research dollars to scientists and medical professionals, and they basically buy influence by sponsoring their work.
That's right. And that's, I mean, this is in some ways the most depressing part of this story is to discover this. Because, I mean, look, I believe that markets work when incentives are aligned properly. And a lot of people think, well, this is private industry and they're competing for vaccines and things like this. This is the most sort of collusive, cronyist market that can possibly be imagined. If you actually look into the relationship between, say, the FDA and private drug companies, this is not a functioning market. One simple example, the fact that drug companies are immune from being sued, for instance, right? It completely destroys the natural incentive that a business would otherwise have. And so whatever trust you might have in natural market mechanisms, you should not import that trust into this situation because the market is anything but free.
Repeat that. We can't sue the drug companies?
We can't sue, so the drug companies
Yeah,
are
they're
immune.
immune.
Yeah, absolutely. They've been granted immunity by the
With
government.
regard to this
With
vaccine.
regard to these vaccines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can't, if you're injured, you can't sue them. I think in the U.S. there's one fund that'll pay out injuries, but it's like extremely low how many there.
I mean, it's a sweet deal if you can get it. Yeah. For
Well,
the drug
as
companies.
a creature of Wall Street, as a creature of private equity, and
Yes.
default mode as businesses
Absolutely.
have got to behave well because you'll kill your reputation if
That's
you
right.
behave egregiously. So I discounted the pharmaceutical
Oh, yeah.
theory.
Well, because you think killing your customers is really a bad business model under normal circumstances, right?
Yeah, and then they're putting out questionable products, and then they're getting the government to do all the marketing. So like for all these products, it's the White House, the media, and the CDC marketing the products. And then like this Comirnaty product, they didn't even have a website for it.
I don't know what the Comirnaty is.
So that is the branded version of the Pfizer vaccine, which
So
isn't yet
so the
available.
company can't be said to market a questionable product, so they have the government market it. And it's like, it's very clever.
Well, let's do Pfizer. Pfizer,
Yeah.
you don't think they're in it for the money? I didn't. I changed my mind. And the report came out I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago. Pfizer had earnings more than doubled in the last quarter, and they had earnings of $7.7 billion, up 133% from a year earlier. And so they've made $3 or $4 billion in just 90 days alone. And so if you're the executives at Pfizer, that's what you're paying attention
I
to.
mean, that's a huge incentive. And look, I'd say if a drug company invents a drug that cures cancer, I want them to respond to incentives and to make a lot of money. But that's not what's
Yeah.
happening
And this
here.
is-
But that brings up
Yeah.
ivermectin,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of people, and
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
among them, who believes ivermectin works.
Yes.
And ivermectin has been around forever. The guy invented it, won the Nobel
Yep.
Prize. It's a so-called off-label drug. It was meant for this one thing, but it also works well with the virus. And yet you're not allowed to not only talk about it, it's tough for physicians to prescribe it.
I mean, this
Yeah,
is.
well, the whole reason behind that is to get to the emergency authorization of the vaccines is only valid if there's not a treatment available. So
Explain
we've
that.
seen this. Well, so to get these vaccines rushed and on the market, they got an emergency use authorization, and that's only by law that can only happen if there isn't a treatment available for
Okay.
the issue. So they have to suppress all the treatments, and this what Alexandra sort of called this treatment nihilism. So they say, okay, vaccine only. We all have to, and they're still telling everyone there's no treatment for COVID-19, and so they said it. So they put out this protocol saying you shouldn't do any treatment at all, and then you wait, and then you get to the hospital after a week if you're sick, and then they're giving people this remdesivir drug, like sedatives, remdesivir, and intubation. And, a lot of doctors I interviewed think that that's what's killing a lot of people in the hospital. So remdesivir is a highly shady drug. There was one trial in 2018 Fauci funded that killed half the people in the trial. So it causes kidney failure. You should not let anyone.
Is that hyperbole, or is that literally half the people in the trial?
In this study in 2018, yeah. So it's a very toxic drug. To give it's like a chemo, So to give that to a flu patient is pretty irrational. But there's huge vested interest. Gilead has this, and it's like $3,000 or $4,000 for a dose, and then Medicaid's giving a 20% kickback to the hospital. So there's huge financial interest. Whereas ivermectin's I don't know, $50, $30, $50.
Ivermectin's out, you can get it generically. And so the financial incentive to use that, apart from the emergency use authorization, which I think is really what's behind the campaign, not to allow off-label use of any drugs. Lots and lots of drugs that people are taking are being taken for off-label use. It's usually up to the doctor, and yet they're prohibited. In this one case, I think it was because of the emergency use authorization, and I think there's kind of natural incentives, is that the alternatives coming online, you can make a lot of money with them. Nobody's making much money with ivermectin.
This is the Bill Walton Show, and I'm here with Jay Richards and James Patrick, and we're talking about everything you wanted to know about the drug companies, but were afraid to ask. Because then I've gone from skeptical about them to pretty upset about their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're responding to incentives. The trick is that people in companies,
market libertarians, we say that.
They say but the incentives are absolutely wrong. This is the problem, is that my trust in the market mechanism isn't based on my trust in human nature. It's that markets, when they're working properly, incentivize people in beneficial ways. But in this case, drug companies and the actors are incentivized to curry favor with the regulators, unfortunately.
Let's talk about what's next. Vaccine passports, vaccine mandates.
Yes.
Lloyd Austin, head of the Defense Department, just said that if you don't get vaccinated, he's going to ask you to leave the military.
This is happening right now. Thousands of members of the U.S. military bill have been asked for exemptions, for religious exemptions. Not one religious exemption to any member of the armed services has been granted. And so if you think about the effects of this, basically we're going to purge people who have moral or religious objections and actually have the strength of their convictions and have moral courage. We're going to purge them from the military. That's an extraordinary thing, especially when you think the average member of the military is not at high risk from this virus.
Well, yeah, in the medical system too, that's really alarming that they're firing everyone who's a doctor or a nurse who doesn't want to take the vaccine. So you're making the industry a lot more dogmatic.
Now, did you talk to some of those people during making of your film?
Which?
The medical professionals who don't trust the vaccine.
Some, yeah, a few doctors, yeah.
And they said?
They said, what were their points on the vaccine?
Yeah.
I think they just said they're seeing a lot of injuries, that they don't think it's efficacious. I didn't go heavily into the vaccine in the film. It's more like 10, 12 minutes in there. I go into the mRNA technology and put a lot of clips of the CEOs of Pfizer and Moderna talking about it. It's very experimental. It's sort of like going in and getting your body to produce putting in these foreign RNA and getting your body to produce these spike proteins, and then they say it goes away after some time, but it's
a rabbit hole of complexity.
It's not certain. It's not clear. And I put a clip of Borla, the CEO of Moderna, and they're saying from January this year, saying if they work, if they do what we think they'll do. And here we're deploying it to millions of people.
So my sense is that the three of us would agree with this statement. We're not sure about whether vaccines work or don't work, but it's up to the individual to decide whether it works for them.
Well, I mean, this
Well, these aren't really vaccines. There's sort of gene therapies, and they got the CDC to call them vaccines, because then you get the
Fair.
immunity. You get the 1986 protection from liability.
You
But
also
it's
get the
more of a
mental-
gene therapy, and I threw in a clip of the Bayer president saying that. He's like, oh, if we didn't have a pandemic, no one would want to be taking gene therapies.
Well, and if you look at the way they were initially authorized, it was for reduction in symptoms. And now all the official people are now saying this. A year ago, they were referring to these as vaccines, as if they conferred some kind of fundamental immunity. We now know that that's not what happens. My sense, looking at the data, is that these vaccines for people that are not in any way injured by them, it probably does confer, some kind of benefit in terms of reduction of symptoms. It's just that benefit itself wears off quickly. You have to keep re-upping, and people should be able to make decisions based upon their personal life situation as to whether that's a risk-reward calculation they want to make, as opposed to this kind of the one-size-fits-all for 330 million people.
Well, but the rush trial criteria to get these passed was doesn't even. It was just for Moderna and Pfizer was just passing one PCR test after a week and the reduction of one flu symptom. So you could put anything through that trial.
The trials
and
are
get
very,
it passed.
are
So
very
the original trials to get them authorized don't test for immunization of anything. They could have done T-cell immunity. They could have done a proper trial that would see if the things were conferring immunity. And that wasn't done. So that they never really claimed to be immunizing anyone against anything.
But they knew by calling them vaccines that people would sort of make the mental connection.
Yeah.
And that's what almost everyone does. Look, I mean, I have Catholic churchmen and bishops who issued statements, Bill, on the assumption that these are immunizing vaccines. So they didn't even manage to get the basic science right.
Yeah, I think people are taking them thinking they're getting an immunization.
Yeah.
And that claim was never made by the manufacturers.
No.
But the media is sort of confusing that in people's minds. The government's confusing that in people's minds. And when you look at the documents and the filings, they don't make any of those claims at all. So there's a real disconnect between what the documents are showing and then what's the public perception.
About what?
And I don't think people also, anyway, there's a whole rack of other issues we could get into with, there appears to be evidence that not all the vaccines are the same. So they could be dosage testing on the public.
Same label, different vaccine inside the bottle?
The VAERS data does seem to show that 1 to 5% of the vaccines are highly toxic, over 1,000 times more toxic than the other 95%, and that's where most of the injuries are occurring. So that would indicate there's variation in the products, and you don't know what you're getting. There's one guy made a site where you can look up the batch numbers, see if you're in a toxic batch. But that raises a whole lot of questions,
Jay, what's Heritage's position on this?
So Heritage, the policy position has been fine with the vaccines. They look at, or the drugs, if you want to take them, great, but very opposed to vaccine mandates or to drug mandates of any kind for everyone, not just for ourselves. So we're challenging the District of Columbia and the federal government on these the initial mandates. But we think it's just a fundamental violation of people's civil rights, and it's also vast overreach about what the government ought to be doing.
Yeah, you don't want the precedent of the government saying they can force you to take an injection or a medical intervention. I mean, it violates all kinds of.
James, you brought up the
international law.
Nuremberg Code in your film.
Yeah, I think
The Nuremberg Code, that's like after the Nazis performed experiments in the concentration
how can you have
camps.
informed
So what's the
consent?
Nuremberg Code?
The people need, after the Nazi episode, the Nuremberg Code was that people have to have informed consent if they're engaging in a medical experiment. The person has to know what they're getting into. And with a lot of these products, the ingredients aren't published, long-term effects aren't known. I mean, it's a complete question mark. And I don't think, like the issues I was raising, people aren't aware of the products they're taking. They're just going and getting them, assuming they're,
Well, and the pushback on that from the people who think these mandates are great is they say, we're not making them do that. Well,
if you're restricting
true,
your-
except if you want to have a job,
Yeah.
go to a restaurant, get on an airplane.
You're still
yeah, I
still
mean,
free,
it's-
sort of like you're still free in North Korea to believe whatever you want to believe inside your head.
yeah, I mean, if you're taking someone's rights away to travel, to have a job, to enter businesses, to have any sort of public life, I mean, yeah, that's forcing, that's coercion. So
So-
creating a new apartheid of exclusion is just, it's a really scary, evil thing that's going on. And it's all in the name of, oh, we're helping you. I mean, this is diabolical. I mean, it's not, like, people need to wake up to what's going on, because this is, the rhetoric is getting weirder and crazier and more aggressive. And, now they're saying, oh, we're offering it. But, I've seen a lot of pundits or experts say, well, the force is coming, but now we're in the offering stage. But it's like the rhetoric is getting crazier
We're
and
saying
crazier.
be nice now, but just
Yeah.
wait.
Yeah, I
If
mean,
this
it's
is what
important we
offering looks
put the
like,
foot
what's
down.
force look like?
Yeah, we got to put the foot down here, because it's only going to get worse. I mean, people are like, oh, I'll do it, it'll get better. It's not going to get better. I
New
mean,
Zealand has internment camps.
Yeah.
yeah, in Australia. So they're openly saying, and it's for unvaccinated people.
And didn't New York just start have people going into restaurants to see whether
Yeah.
people had their,
Yeah. Pulling
Yeah.
people out.
And,
Just-
my, being the kid in me thought, well, we used to get fake IDs to buy beer. Maybe
Right.
we'll just do a fake vaccine mandate.
I'm
But
assuming there's a
evidently-
bunch of those floating around already.
Well, but
Yeah.
they've made it a federal.
Oh, is that
They've
right?
made it a felony.
Okay.
It's not just a I can't know what the penalties are, but it's not,
Yeah.
it's not some little thing. Chicago, I think, has made it a felony.
Really?
Fortunately, they don't
Yeah.
enforce the law in Chicago, so maybe it'll,
This is the one law.
yeah, so one
Yeah, I
will
mean, yeah.
enforce.
It's
The
like in
police are just-
DC, the only thing they get right is parking tickets.
That's right. Parking
Yeah.
tickets and jaywalking.
I mean, now it's just these paper systems, but I know a law was proposed. I'm not sure if it was passed to make a federal vaccine database for U.S., because now it's distributed. There's no central records of anything. It's done state by state. But I mean, now it's just these paper informal systems. But like the Rockefeller and Gates Foundations are funding blockchain immunity records, so that there'll be this you can't hide. It's an indelible record. I mean, this is really Orwellian, or way worse than Orwell. I mean, this is really making like the Nazi period look like a cakewalk. I mean, what's coming?
This is the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with James Patrick and Jay Richards, and we're talking about the Orwellian aspect of all these mandates and these passports and the things that are coming. Let's take the last segment here, though, to talk just about what we see happening with regard to civil liberties, and also where we think how we might be able to get out of this. You talk about the, Nazi Germany, China today has got social credit system.
Absolutely.
They've got facial recognition. They've got artificial intelligence that can, basically, if you go on a camera, within about 30 seconds, a computer in Beijing can do facial recognition to tell you what you are. And if you're doing something they don't approve of, you get a black mark on your social credit register.
Yeah, and that's in Europe. They're deploying these systems. Israel just announced the same system.
What are they doing in Europe? The same facial
Exact.
recognition?
Well, the social credit. There's a bunch of patents that were filed this last summer, talking about that, using your contagiousness, your threat level of this phony virus threat social credit score. So they'll say, oh, well, we deem you a higher threat, so you're not allowed to have any rights or go here or there. So it's like this virus narrative is being used to voice this social credit system in the name of this virus. But none of this stuff is about a virus. I think that's sort of the cover story or the distraction to the real main act, which is an economic and political takeover. And the virus is to scare people into going along with it.
Okay, well, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but it's hard not to think about that. But a conspiracy requires coordination among a few people, and this seems to be thousands of actors and different types of actors. I mean, the winners here run from Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and all the whole digital world's a big winner here. Governments are a winner because they've increased their power. Pharmaceutical companies, obviously. I mean, who are the other winners here that have a stake in seeing us lose our freedom?
I think the big banks and holding companies, like seeing the economy just consolidate into all the little, small, medium-sized businesses going away, and there's just a lot more industry around this technocracy, around these digitizing everything, making everything recorded. It's pushing society in a direction we don't want to go.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think you have to, I don't think this. I don't think, that the virus was intentionally released or anything like that. I do think, and in fact, I would bet money that it was leaked from a lab.
I will not take the other side of that bet.
No, okay. But that's separate from, it being intentional. I do think that a lot of people saw the pandemic as a wonderful opportunity to deploy their ideas. I mean, Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum said this quite explicitly, right? I mean, you're not supposed to talk about his Great Reset, but it's like, it's not a conspiracy. It's on the internet. It's right here.
Remind us, the Great Reset.
The Great Reset is a restructuring of global capitalism for the 21st century in a much more, it always sounds nice, and much more human-centered and sustainable way, in which the robots will do all the drudgery and we won't own anything and we'll all be very happy. But he quite explicitly said that this is an opportunity for us to restructure things. And so this is not this is not some tinfoil hat crazy conspiracy. It's exactly what he thinks. That doesn't follow Klaus Schwab orchestrated the whole thing. It does mean that he and people like him are very happy for this opportunity.
Yeah, it looks like an attempt to create a sort of world communism where if they have everything digitized, then they could get it to work. Like communism collapsed because Soviet Union collapsed because they couldn't coordinate prices, but now if they can literally tell everyone what to do and micromanage everything digitally, they're thinking, people like Schwab think that it has a shot at working.
So I'm trying to get at a definition here. It's not a conspiracy in the sense you've got the little guy behind the curtain in Oz with the machine out front, but it is an elite consensus.
See, this is the thing.
I mean,
this is why
there's a consensus
that's the
of
way
the elites.
to think of it. Is that I say there's no need for a single person to orchestrate things. If you have a lot of powerful people, all of whom think exactly alike, then it's sort of a conspiracy of consensus. And so, if everybody can be expected to do the same thing and to think the same way, you get what looks very much like coordination. You don't need three guys controlling all this. Besides which, none of these guys are all that smart. They can't actually have predicted what would happen. In fact, I think most people, would have thought that lockdowns wouldn't work. I think most of the people that have implemented the lockdowns 2.5 years ago would never have imagined that Americans would be so compliant. I would never have guessed it, but boy, we have been very compliant.
But I think
They didn't work to stop the virus, but they did work to show how compliant people
Absolutely
could be.
are. They know
I think
that.
it's important I like to encourage people to stay away from the debates of the lab leak or the alternative treatments or the virus or this. It's really, the main issue is like we're having our rights taken away. And all these things are excuses and distractions. We cannot let governments do this to us. And it violates our fundamental rights. And whether it's planned or not, or lab or this, that, I mean, it's really not important. The real issue is like they're taking everything from us.
You've been talking, I love lines of action if we can find one. Did a line of action come out of your film?
Yeah, I think like don't boycott businesses that are asking for these passports, like sue the government, protest, like don't go along with this stuff because you're not going to win anything from it. You're just going to lose everything.
I mean, this is the good news about this is that almost all of it's happened because the masses have been compliant. I think it ceases to happen when the masses cease to be compliant. That's not a call to violence. It's simply a call to just basic resistance. The other thing is, if you notice that
You're just not going to go get in the back of the bus.
Just don't do that. Yeah, just refuse to do it, and be willing to take a couple of personal hits for that. If everyone is willing to do that, if everyone's willing to just say, okay, this is an inopportune time to get up and walk to the front of the bus, but by golly, I'm going to do it. The second thing is that the courts have not been, for the most part, very friendly to any of these things. So these mandates, especially that the federal government is trying and that President Biden is trying, I think are on very shaky ground legally. And so there's a heck of a lot of lawfare still, I think, to be
Yeah.
implemented. And I think I think there'll be more positive court cases coming down the pike.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I interviewed this lawyer in Rome, and he was saying like the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court was corrupt and was ruling for them, but all the lower courts were deciding that it wasn't constitutional. But the Constitutional Court was these corrupt ones, and they were. But I think if people fight it, like I interviewed a guy in Virginia, who is a small business owner, and he sued and he won.
Absolutely.
And I think if people will win in court if they fight it. So
They do.
yeah.
I mean, Todd Zywicki, who won with George Mason.
We had Todd
You
here.
had him on
Yeah.
your show. He's a perfect example. He had naturally acquired immunity. It was an irrational policy. But then the ruling, the school basically granted him an allowance, but they didn't make it. It wasn't a sort of general decision. But the point is he's the only one that's tried this. Why aren't there thousands of professors that they've had it? Why aren't they doing it? And this is part of the problem. This was part of the problem in Washington, D.C. It was left to one little Baptist church to decide that this crazy requirement that only 50 people can come in was an unreasonable call, and it turns out the court agreed with them. But it was one church that did this. Why wasn't it every church? Why wasn't it the Washington Archdiocese? It's because almost everyone is compliant.
Yeah, and so I kind of get into this in the end of the film. Is like, well, what does it take to say no?
Yeah, let's wrap up here
Yeah, yeah.
with that. Let's continue.
Yeah, because to say no is difficult. I mean, you have to kind of know who you are. You have to look inside, have the inner strength and courage, and it's scary for a lot of people to go out on your own. So I explore this in the end of the film on like, what does it mean to say no? What does it mean to know who you are, and to have that strength and courage? Because it's like a spiritual question of what are we here in alive on earth now? Why are we incarnated here to living our lives, to have these experiences? If we remove the individuality, and if we just go along with these technocratic things, we lose the very meaning of life. So it's important for people to look inside and realize who they are, and have the courage to be themselves. And that's the most fulfilling thing anyone can do. And that's, I've had to do that in making this film, and a lot of the people I interviewed, they have had to do that. And it's you might lose friends, but you're going to gain just as many who are also saying no, and it's a really fulfilling experience.
Jay?
I hate to sort of say anything else after that, but that is exactly, if people forget everything else, that's the message. Just be willing to exercise personal courage, moral courage, do the right thing, and resist this. And if millions of us do that, I think it ends.
Jay Richards, Senior Fellow, the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at Heritage Foundation, and James Patrick, filmmaker extraordinaire of the film Passport, Lockdown Planet?
Planet Lockdown.
Planet Lockdown.
Yeah.
It's coming out January 15th.
January 15th,
We can
yeah.
look for it on the internet.
Yeah, it'll be at planetlockdownfilm.com. It's released for free. I'm going to release it in 10 languages.
Great.
So it's
Well,
an
thank you.
international film
It's a real
for
service.
international problem.
Okay, this has been the Bill Walton Show, and thanks for joining us. You can find us on the BillWaltonShow.com and YouTube and Rumble and all the other major audio podcast platforms. Hope you learned something today. I know I did, and looking forward to have you back again. And I mention YouTube optimistically because I think we've furthered the debate here, Mr. YouTube, and we think we ought to keep this debate up on the channel.
Yes.
So let's hope we've followed community guidelines, guys. All right, thanks.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.